Hey everybody, and welcome to yet another season of my Nostalgia Trip games here at Finnish Retro Game Comparison Block TV YouTube channel. This season we'll start with another new acquisition to my retro gaming collection, and I bought myself an Amstrad CPC 464. Yeah, I got this from the UK about a few months ago, maybe November, I can't remember anymore, but yeah. The reason why I'm a bit late with this right now is because I had to get a new cable for it to actually record the stuff with sound. And I also bought this. It's a USB drive basically. You could launch any disc game from this. But yeah, my actual nostalgia for this machine is basically one of my friends from my youth had one of these Amstrad CPCs, maybe for 2 or 3 years, and we used to play maybe a dozen games with it regularly, although he had maybe 50 games on it. But yeah, I guess we'll get through the entire actual nostalgia stuff for the Amstrad in maybe 2 or 3 episodes. So here's the first one. Enjoy.
I distinctly remember going through a bunch of cheap games from Amsoft, which apparently came bundled with the computer. One of the most revisited games from that lot was an Amidar clone called Oh Mummy, developed by Gem Software. Although the basic idea is the same, you open the squares by walking around them, Oh Mummy is a bit easier and more simplistic than Amidar because the levels are all made in an even grid rather than an uneven grid, which also makes the enemy movement more based on following you than on following the grid in a certain linear manner. The difficulty level progression in Oh Mummy is very linear in the addition of one enemy for each level. Sure, it's not the most exciting of games you can find for the Amstrad, nor for any other platform it was released on, but the simplistic nature and solid execution can keep you coming back to it every now and then. It's certainly good nostalgia trip material. Heralded as one of the worst racing games ever created, the next item on today's list is Crazy Cars. As it happens, the Amstrad version is one of the least unplayable ones from all the numerous versions out there, and I was arguably lucky to play this version the first. Of course, you can see from this footage that even though I say it's one of the better versions of Crazy Cars, it's still not a particularly interesting game. Compared to many similar games, the amount of cars you need to pass are relatively few and far between, and the scenery never changes throughout the game's 9 levels, all of which comprise of 9 stages, all of which are driven through non-stop. I had never actually bothered to attempt to play this game through, but there's a long play video on YouTube which goes on for an hour and 5 minutes before the game loops from the beginning without much of fanfare. The thing that Crazy Cars does well is the changes in road level formations, so you get surprise jumps and judderings and various kinds of curves. You also change between 3 different cars as you make progress, and the changes happen at the turn of each level. You start with a Mercedes-Benz, then you get to drive a Porsche in level 2, and the third one I assume to be a Ferrari. Well, there's not much more I can honestly say about this game other than it's still not worth digging out, unless your nostalgia factor for it is bordering on unhealthy. Games based on the adventures of the world's most famous secret agent have never been particularly well conceived, and while this is arguably the worst of the lot, Domark's take on Roger Moore's final outing as James Bond, A View to a Kill, is oddly the least horrible on the Amstrad of all versions. What I mean by oddly is that the Amstrad version is played in the wrong order. The game is played in 3 parts, which in the original movie order are: first the Paris chase, in which Bond drives around Paris as he follows the paragliding Mayday; second, the San Francisco City Hall, which Max Zorin has set on fire and you need to find items and get yourself out of the building; And finally, the Silicon Valley Mine, which sort of expands on the City Hall format, as you just need to wander around the mine and deal with the explosives. The order of levels in the Amstrad version is exactly the opposite, which makes no sense, but in a way makes the game a bit more playable because it leaves the least interesting level to the last. I admit that I haven't actually played this game in all its released formats, but I have attempted to get to grips with the game in its Spectrum, C64 and Amstrad versions, mostly with less than stellar results. It was also released for the MSX computers as well as Tangerine's Auric 1 and Auric Atmos, so it's not an impossible prospect to write a comparison of this game, but I'd really rather not because it's bad enough not to bother. Probably the best example I can think of a game that I enjoyed more on the Amstrad than on the C64 back in the day is Renegade. Now, I'm not a fan of this game nor this genre by any means, even though there are some exceptions, but Renegade should be considered a necessary part of arcade gaming history to get acquainted with, particularly if you're a fan of these brawler-type games. And for this reason, I wrote the comparison of Renegade in early 2016. Link in the description. Ocean's home computer conversions of Technos Japan's arcade hit Neketsu Kuru Hakunyukun was received with mixed feelings on the 8-bits, but the Amstrad and Spectrum versions both managed to pull it off better than the C64, mostly because of the optional keyboard controls. The game does, after all, have 3 buttons for fighting in the original arcade version, one for punching, one for kicking, and one for jumping, so the keyboard option suits the game much better. However, in the Amstrad version, the fighting proceedings have been slightly altered from the original. Here you're somehow always facing the enemies regardless of how you want to fight them, and the fight buttons are directional instead of punches and kicks. Actually, the controls are a bit weird even on the keyboard because you jump by pressing the down cursor key, while the punches and kicks are delivered with left and right cursor keys, and you walk around with almost the now traditional WASD input, except you walk down with spacebar instead of S. It's a bit awkward, but it's still much better than having just one action key. The most infuriating thing about Renegade, which I've always hated, is the way you get constantly ganged up by anything up to 4 enemies, and some of the enemies run backwards the same speed you run forwards, making it next to impossible getting them to a good place to actually have a fair fight. The learning curve is also pretty damn steep, because the first level boss fight starts before you kill all the other thugs on the screen, and it requires you to have a good grip on all the fight moves and a strategy on how to get the boss thug to not kill you instantly. Regardless of all that, Renegade's best 8-bit version is on the Amstrad, and it's the one I choose to play if I ever feel like I need to get really angry at something. For our final entry for this episode, I decided to include all the Roland games I remember playing, because otherwise they would continue to be useless filler material for the next 2 or 3 Amstrad episodes. The Roland series officially contains 8 games, which were made between 1984 and 1985. Roland in the Caves, Roland in Time, Roland Ahoy, Roland Goes Digging, Roland on the Run, Roland on the Ropes, Roland Goes Square Bashing, and Roland in Space. What's weird about the series is that 2 of the games are rebranded from previously released games. Roland on the Ropes is the game Fred, and Roland in the Caves is La Pulga, or Bugaboo the Flea, both games from the Spanish developer Indescomp, and released elsewhere by Quicksilver. But these 2 are the ones I remember most vividly, and have revisited most often since, so far as to write comparisons of both games in a 2-for-1 article. As usual, the link can be found in the video description. Fred, or Roland on the Ropes, is a labyrinth platformer in which you need to collect treasures and find the exit before you get eaten alive by ghosts. Nothing fantastic, but enjoyable enough to warrant repeated attempts. Bugaboo the Flea, or Roland in the Caves, is one of the most infuriating yet most interesting platformers in which your movement is entirely based on the distribution of power to your feet by pressing either movement direction for a period of time. Much more recommendable than Fred, but also much more frustrating. As for the other Roland games I remember playing more than 2 seconds, Roland in Time is definitely one of the more memorable ones. And that one's not much more than a Manic Miner clone, loosely based on Doctor Who, but without the proper licensing. Roland on the Run was another one from the series I remember playing a few times, and that one is basically a Frogger clone in skewed 3D. Nothing particularly interesting, but if you didn't wonder about it before, doesn't it appear weird that Roland can be a flea in one game, a human in the next? I mean, what sort of creature is he anyway? Well, whatever the answer to that is, the last Roland game I remember playing is the last game in the series, Roland in Space. It's more of that Doctor Who-based platforming nonsense in the vein of Jet Set Willy and such, but more frustrating and unattractive. The other games in the series are an odd pirate shooter, Roland Ahoy, a Space Panic clone called Roland Goes Digging, and then there's Roland Goes Square Bashing, which is something of a Q-Bert clone, or a variant, but I have had very little experience on any of those. But it's the cheap bundle games like these that gets under every classic 8-bit computer owner's skin and gets you nostalgic for no better reason than the fact that they take you back to those days. But that should be enough.